we are really very privileged to have you to us. Dr. Avery worked for Ezeco Museums for 40 years, but he's now retired. But like many of us retired people, that doesn't mean you stop working. It just means you do the work that you enjoy doing. Graham is a paleozoologist. That means that he evaluates animal materials retrieved from archaeological sites, not just the physical remains of those animals, but also evidence, images of the animals in rock paintings and other surfaces. His particular interest is insight into human behavior as reflected by the bird bones and the shellfish found in the various excavations. He has been intimately involved in the excavations at the Klipgat Cave at the Kelders, just down the road from us, both as a student for his PhD thesis, and then more recently, he co-hosted or co-directed the excavations in the 1990s at the Klipgat Cave. And if you've ever been there, you will have noticed the beautiful informational boards that are up at the cave, and Graham was consultant on erecting those boards. So if you have never been to the Klipgat Cave, I urge you to go. It is really, really interesting. So let us then hand over to our speaker, who I hope is going to appear because I don't see him in his picture now. Graham, are you there?
I can see me.
Oh, there now I can see you. I saw your bookcase before.
Oh,
so if we can,
I disappeared to get some water.
Oh, good. Graham, we could like to hand over to you now, and if you can tell us more about all these wonderful excavations that you have been involved with. Thanks. Over to you.
Right. Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming, and that's in inverted commas these days. I really am, very pleased to be able to talk to you and impart some of the knowledge that I've gained over the last years, starting in a number of archaeological sites in the Western Cape, including Klipgat, as it was known in those days as the Kelders Cave 1. When I was a long-haired, gangly student in 1969, working with Frank Schweitzer, who was the archaeologist at the time. First of all, just to give you a little bit of context, we're just a speck of the last 3 million years of a 3.8 at least giga-year evolutionary development of life on the Earth. And just for reference sake, you'll see at the bottom, MA equals million years, GA is a billion or giga, and KA is kilo or 1,000 years ago. You'll see that pop up from time to time, mostly the MA and the KA. I don't think there were any people around in a billion years ago. Why? There we go. Right. I need to, can you see through these faces?
Yeah.
I can't, I mean, if you can see the
yes, we can see, but if anyone thinks that their slides are obscured, they can just click at the top of those faces. There's a little minus where they can minimize that panel on the side. But for me, it's fine. Yeah, okay, fine.
Now we need to just go back previous. There we go. Over the last 35 million years, we've seen amazing changes in the climate and environments of the Earth. And a lot of this sort of information comes from oxygen isotopes and also microfossils, particularly microfossils from ocean cores. Um, and during this time, we've had repeated cycles of warm, cold conditions, which have affected the temperature and vegetation and the animals on the Earth. Um, and if you look at the images there, first of all, you see this dot here is the present sea level, and you can see that 35,000 years ago, there were these enormously high sea levels up to, in this instance, 200 meters. And then subsequently, about 10 million years ago, things started fluctuating on a more regular basis, and with much lower highs, but nevertheless quite significant lows. And if you drop down to, let's see if I can keep this. Yeah, this little machine doesn't work at that. There we go. If you drop down over here and move this way, and then back across and that way, you've got something of the order of 3 million years from this point here of fluctuations. And you can see how they vary. And this is the current sea level here. And you can see we've had ups and downs, starting off at about 100,000 year cycles, and then moving on to 40,000 year cycles, which we're in now. And up here where we are at present sea level, with, of course, the sea level currently rising. In effect, if that cycling system was to continue in the old way, we should be beginning to move towards a lower sea level and cooler conditions leading to another ice age. So the lows down to about 130 meters are in fact, there you go, that's the last ice age there, and up to the present. So the last ice age, the sea level went down by 120 to 130 meters. And there a lot of the information which has been datable and from which these details have been gleaned are these beautiful little microscopic foraminifera. These are just a few examples, so you can see how rather impressive they are. And of course, on a more terrestrial basis, but also pollens get blown out to sea and occur in ocean cores. We have pollen fossils as well, and these can give us biostratigraphy, sea surface temperatures. They tell us when the Benguela upwelling and the Fynbos conditions started developing, and of course sea level changes and paleo-environmental changes as well. During this time, there were quite a lot of changes, and just to give you an indication, on a repeated basis, the coastlines extended back and forth. In that really early times, they didn't necessarily extend out to sea. They extended quite far inland, and I'll talk a little bit about the Langebaanweg Fossil Park, which was an example of a 45-meter high sea level, which brought the coast quite far inland, about 15 kilometers. And one of the important things is that conditions became favorable for a whole range of animals which don't normally occur historically in the Western Cape. And these included a wide range of grazers, as well as some browsers. But basically what this is telling us is that conditions as the coastlines extended allowed animals which would normally have been in, say, the Renosterveld and other areas to move down towards the coastline where there was Strandveld, which had suitable grazing for such animals. Just as a quick insert, I found this very recently. This is you can see here, this is the seabed just off the Hermanus area and down towards the beginnings of Danger Point. And you can see this rather rough area, but the most important thing to concentrate on is this sort of line here of depths. So you've got a 50-meter line here, I think that's it, or 60, 50, 60. And the coastline at that time, which is about 50 to 60,000 years ago, would have been something like this. And the Kelders Cave is a good example of that. And then the whole of this bay area, False Bay included, and right around to Cape Town would have been, the coastline would have been somewhere down along this contour down here. Very, very much more open areas of coastal foreland, which would have attracted a lot of animals.
Yeah, but not at the moment.
At Langebaan
Sorry,
Weg,
Diana, can you mute yourself, please? Sorry, Diana.
at Langebaan Weg, the West Coast Fossil Park, there's a channel which filled with bones that were washing down the proto-Berg River. And here you can see an example of really, those are 1 meter squares which have been gridded. So it's a very small area of a large area. And this is another one of Cape Town's little paleo gems. If you haven't visited the West Coast Fossil Park, that should be on your bucket list as well. And again, a very different scenario 5.2 million years ago. Along that river bank, the vegetation was quite tropical or subtropical. There were large numbers of birds, many of which were our ancestors of modern birds, and the same for the mammals. Similarly, there were several species of hyena, most of which became extinct and have been replaced by our modern 3 hyenas, which occur in Africa. Okapi, that's something that only occurs these days in Central Africa, and 3 or 4 different types of elephant, really ancient elephants, including the Gomphothere, which is this little guy on the extreme right, which had tusks in the upper as well as the lower jaw. And these are ancestral mammoths, apparently, and other mastodon types of animals. Short-necked giraffes are very common, particularly in these channels. And it looks almost as if there was a die-off, perhaps after a drought or a major crossing, such as we get in East Africa with the migrations, a major die-off, and the bones were then washed into these river channels where they were deposited and fossilized. The other thing that was happening at the time, a little bit later, was that the vegetation opened up and it became more savanna-like than the tropical riverine forest. A number of different animals occurred there. It's one of the most diverse faunas in the world for this time period. There was a bear, an African bear, a wolverine, saber-toothed cats, shells, and a whole range of other animals that occurred at the time, and some of them looking quite strange, like on the top left here, this antlered looking antelope, a 3-toed horse, and here, and various other tiny little smaller animals, and micro mammals, micro rodents, micro reptiles, micro amphibians also occurred. It's a truly remarkable site. And the other interesting thing is, because the samples are so large, one can actually look at the the age groups that are present. And if you look at that civethere, it's quite clear that really young animals were dying, and that might well fit the drought scenario, like young animals, whereas for an ancestral white rhino, it was mostly prime adults that were dying. And that probably reflects the needs of the animals for vegetation that they could access. There's a marine element, a very strong marine element, including a whole range of well, not a range of seals, but seals and sharks and other fish, seabirds. And this is just an example of the evidence that one finds that a whalebone had been chewed on by a white shark. And you can see in those cuts the striations that are part of the serrated edges of white shark teeth. Other marine deposits down in Saldanha Bay, you can see those big rounded boulders. Some of them were really quite massive and approached more a sort of meter by meter size. And in amongst those, there were deposits of marine shells, which we were able to collect. This whole area in Saldanha Bay Harbour has since been terraforced to protect the walls and to make them safe. Bits and pieces, there are people parked below this marine deposit, and you can see boulders that sort of popped out of there and rolled down onto the, I wouldn't want to put my car into that area. Just to, again, a little bit of context, this is a bit outdated, but Langebaan is down here at 5.2 million years, and South African hominids, mostly in the cradle of mankind, only really are dated to just over 3 million years going forward. And Duinefontein, which I will talk about, is the oldest example of a hominid in the Western Cape, and that's Homo heidelbergensis, which is effectively an archaic or very early example of Homo sapiens. So moving on from Homo heidelbergensis, one found Neanderthals, which didn't occur in Africa. They occurred in Europe and Asia, and of course, our modern, or leading up to our modern Homo sapiens, which we all belong to. Stone tools begin about 2.5 million years ago with the older one, and then move forward, becoming more and more technologically sophisticated right up to the contact period. We working on some of these sites, they're large areas which have bones and artifacts and other evidence. And I was lucky in those days to get a bunch of very enthusiastic South African Archaeological Society people to join me for long weekends when we worked in a gridded area where they plotted and recorded the bones in an area which was probably surrounded a series of ponds in amongst dunes. Now, the very early material at Duinefontein is probably over 1 million years old, and that includes saber-toothed cats and a different species of short-necked giraffe to the one at Langebaan. So this is a more recent example. But also, here's the skull cap of this early Homo heidelbergensis from Duinefontein, or the Hopefield site, and a reconstruction by Cedric Hunter, who used to work at the Iziko South African Museum, a brilliant scientific illustrator, showing a family group with a threesome of an extinct megalotragus looking on, as it were, being suddenly startled, coming over the hill and seeing a little campsite. And what we tried to show here was the interactions between old people and young people. So you see here a youngster leaning up against his dad, a mum with her baby, and granny and grandpa also being looked after in the family group. Stone tools, these come from near Atlantis, and there are various places where they get exposed, and one can see these early Stone Age artifacts, which could be very close to 1 million years old. Some of them ranging from then to maybe 300,000 or 400,000 years. If we look at the reconstruction using the evidence that comes from Duinefontein, the pollens, fossil fauna, and trace fossils, such as the pupa cases of beetles, one gets the very clear picture of wetlands or ponds that occurred at the time, attracted animals and even people, where they lived and died, scavenged, and so on. And this is the example of, at Duinefontein, there's an artesian spring, which is probably, except for the green pollution, is probably very similar to the ponds that would have occurred 400 to 1 million years ago. At the time of Duinefontein, there were pollens tell us there were large trees, also species which don't occur there at this stage. A little interesting point here is we get what we call trace fossils, and here is the drilled burrow of a beetle into the jaw of a lion. This is the femur of an antelope, but the jaw of the lion with a drilled hole. And elsewhere we find the examples of these pupa cases, which is what they were doing. They drilled into the sediment, created their little nest cavity, laid their eggs, and the beetle larvae grew and then emerged. We also find areas which are very clearly hyena dens, where we find fossilized bones accumulated and concentrations of what hyena dung, which are the fossilized hyena dung we call coprolites. And so these are concentrations. Here you can see an articulated ulnar and radius of a rhino, and some bones here of a kudu or an eland. Really quite concentrated, as opposed to the general distribution of bones around the landscape around waterholes. And here you have brown hyenas, jackals interacting and passing by part of a herd of Cape zebra, which is a very large zebra, which was common at the time and became extinct about 10 or 12,000 years ago in the Western Cape. And longhorned buffalo, similarly common at Duinefontein and existed all the way down to 10 or 12,000 years ago. If we look at the Duinefontein fauna, one of the noticeable things is down at the bottom here, there are a whole lot of animals which have become extinct. And this is a feature of Duinefontein and its age. And some of these animals died out, others were ancestral to modern animals that we find here. You can see a range of animals. There's the longhorned buffalo, eland still existing, kudu, greater kudu, gemsbok, grijsbok, the southern springbuck. This is an extinct springbuck, Rex springbuck, and so on. So it's very different, similar but different to the modern fauna that we have. And fire was prevalent. Here's an example of of tortoises that died during the course of the 2000 fires that raged through from pretty well Melkbos all the way to Hopefield. And here in the bottom image are three tortoises, which almost certainly were burnt and died, apparently by asphyxiation rather than being toasted. Moving along to about 300,000 years, we have a site on Cape Town's doorstep, which is in the Klipgat Nature Reserve. You can see the Klipgat Power Station in the distance and Table Mountain, and a group with United States funding excavated a very large area. This is only a part of it at the early stages. A very large area, very close to 1,000 square meters. So that's a whole hectare. And we found two main layers of fossils there, which included here, for example, the thoracic area of an eland and bones lying around the surface. Lots of frog bones and even some casts of aquatic mollusks, indicating yet again that these sites are formed around water bodies which attracted the animals. Now, again, moving on to getting closer to your whale conservation area, although the whole area should be conserved. And here we have a NASA image which shows Robben Island, well, the coast from Robben Island until basically Walker Bay, going around. Hermanus would be somewhere along here with the plot just showing over there. And what I've shown here is essentially, it's not accurate, but if you drop the sea level, you create enormous extensions of the coastline, and some of the large bays that exist now would have been landlocked and provided habitat for a wide range of animals, which again, historically, the fauna in the Fynbos and even the Strandveld was pretty poor compared to the biodiversity that we find in these in the late Pleistocene, and assumed that that's where our sites are, assuming that that would have been something that continued back in time when sea levels were lower. This is a reconstruction of of False Bay. The evidence for the animals comes from a hyena den. You can see the pups over here, brown hyenas scavenging, jackals trying to get their bits, and a range of animal, first of all, the water bodies and the wetlands, but hippos in False Bay, longhorned buffalo. There were white rhino, which doesn't occur this far south or east or west, Cape zebra, springbuck, wildebeest, and so on, a large range or diversity of animals. And down in the front here, you have a southern reedbuck, which again doesn't occur in our region any longer. And it's indicative of these reed beds and long grass. So it's giving us information about, giving us evidence and information about the biodiversity and the paleo environment at the time. Esterfontein 1, which is a site very well just above the road that leads to the harbour at Esterfontein. When they cut down to level a new road and parking area, they cut through a shell midden, which is in the back of this ridge, which formed overhangs in which people came. And we're looking in this site of the earliest shell middens we have on the west coast, between 119 and 112,000 years old. And this is one of the occurrences. On the left, we've got two valves of a pelagic barnacle, which occurs on whales. So when you see a picture of for instance, a humpback whale, and on the flippers, you see white blobs on the flippers, or you go to Iziko South African Museum and you look at the whales, you see these white blobs on them. Those are these pelagic barnacles. And when we find them in archaeological sites, which is quite rare, it tells us that people were bringing blubber back to the caves and as food. And we refer to this as the invisible whale. The bones of whales and dolphins that we find tend, I think, to be, dolphins could be carried back to a site if they washed up. Whales would have to be cut up, and that's what we find. So when we find whale bones, they are probably, they could be part of a flipper, for instance, but we also think they were brought back as raw material for artifacts. And then moving again on to up to Saldanha Bay, just as yet another example of one of these coastal changes during a lowered sea level. If you drop Saldanha Bay down by about 40 to 50 meters, the coastline there is again offshore, and Saldanha Bay would have been landlocked and provided really nice, probably dune thicket vegetation, which would have suited the range of animals that occurred there, particularly rhinos and eland. And then there would have been in that vegetation type, you get more grass than you would in the normal sand fynbos, and that would have suited the grazers, which are also common at a site named preeuwalle. Now, this is what it looks like. Normally, you don't sometimes even see these calcretes because they're covered by beach sand, which is deposited by the sea. But after storms, there's can be a lot of erosion, and in this particular case, it cut down a good 1.5 meters and exposed these very hard calcretes. Come on, they're at the top, which we've dated, and also for humified, that's dark looking layers, as you can see near the bottom there, two examples arrowed. And these dark fossil clay deposits are full of bones, and we think these were these animals that were in these areas during seasonal fluctuation of the water levels. And if you know Rocha Pan, or indeed parts of the Kleinrivier Play, you probably could get a very good idea of how things fluctuate seasonally and during droughts. And again, in an area like the winter rainfall area, with dry summers, a small water body would have been a godsend for a large number of animals, and indeed people who also utilized them. Here's the part of the jaw of one of these big Cape zebras. These are eland teeth. And you can see this black humified material, which we think is the rotting vegetation, sedges and such like. And we actually find remnants of sedges in the form of hard root rhizome casts and traces of stems which have rotted away. And up in these areas, you can see all these little white speckles above and below. These are aquatic and semi-aquatic mollusks, which again indicate the seasonality of these water bodies, with very few of water, not surprisingly, very few of the mollusks in the humified areas with with the fossil bones, because then they would have been relatively dry. The animals move in for water, living and dying, and so on. So, and this is the current analysis of the fauna from preeuwalle. You can see we've actually, very rare is this megalotragus, which is so-called a giant hartebeest. It's not really a hartebeest, but it's called a giant hartebeest. We've got one bone, so it's not a lot, but the swallow is telling us something. Again, the longhorned buffalo, but really the longhorned buffalo and the Cape zebra, and nowadays the quagga, and and somewhere in here, yes, blue antelope. We were probably the main cause of certainly the blue antelope, which was, by that stage, it had become very uncommon by historical times, and was relatively easily shot out. And similarly, the quagga was basically shot out. But you can see a range of animals, very large and small, and the black rhinoceros, again with these lowered areas. The preeuwalle sample is currently intertidal, but it is related to probably some form of barrier water body behind dunes, remnants of which still occur in the sea just off this site. So that barrier would have dammed up water, which attracted quite a range of animals, both predators and scavengers. We've also looked at some of the tartar in teeth of the buffalo and the Cape zebra. And the Cape zebra was predominantly eating grass, as one might expect, but the buffalo was eating a mixture of grass and sedges. And this is based on the phytoliths, which are little silicious fossils which occur in the stems of woody vegetation. And now another source of information, the preeuwalle is basically a landscape which animals came and lived and died, whereas this GMC1 is a hyena accumulation. Brown hyenas den and bring food back to their pups. Bits of bone, they mainly scavenge, and they bring lots of bones which accumulate, and they provide these incredible examples and assemblages which tell us about the biodiversity and indeed the paleo environments at the time. So again, this is 50 to 60,000 years ago. We've got some better dates as well, so we'd probably be able to fine tune that. Black rhino seems to be the common rhino. We haven't found white rhino yet. And the black rhino, as when national parks were planning to introduce, or looking at the possibility of introducing black rhino to the West Coast National Park, they bought up land on the east of the R27. But when their ecologists had a look at the vegetation, they said, no, that's not where they would be. They'd be on the coast in the Strandveld, which provided the relevant or the necessary nutrients and woody and succulent vegetation, which would have suited the rhino, plus the grazers, the Cape zebra, there's quagga, reedbuck, there's blue antelope, black wildebeest, as you can see, was pretty common, no longer historically anywhere near that. They might have occurred in the Renosterveld further inland, and during these periods of lower lowered sea level, they and other grazers took advantage of the extended strunt-felt vegetation. And even one of the things we do find, but rarely in hyaena accumulations, or even bits and pieces of people. Brown hyenas are predominantly scavengers, so in those days people weren't being buried per se, or if they were, very shallowly. And so a body out in the open, like at Glacial River mouth archaeological site, would have been scavenged very, very quickly. And it's unusual because human bones are pretty soft and can be chewed up for their nutriments. At the time, the sea wasn't all that far away, and the hyenas were in fact accessing seals, the odd seal and seabird on the coast, which could have been quite far away from the point of view of hyenas, which can actually forage 25 to even 50 kilometers in a night. We move on to Klipgat, which, as Anina was saying, should be on your bucket list. And we did these reconstructions with the illustrations by Toby Beale, who's a remarkable, again, scientific illustrator, as well as a general illustrator. He's the man who did the rock art symbols that occur on our national heraldry. And again, for the Middle Stone Age, we're looking at 50 to 80,000 years ago. And it's the same feature. Hermanus would be up at the end of the plot here, which in the past would have been somewhere along here, with the cave now right on the coast. And again, an example of the fauna that is has been brought back to the cave, which reflects the environment of that lowered sea level Cape foreland with rhinos. These were black rhinos, again, also presumably because of the strunt-felt. Dussies, mole rats, the small ones. There were lots, and there were layers of mouse and shrew bat remains brought in by barn owls. And there's even some evidence that black eagles might have roosted on the cliffs above the cave. The longhorned buffaloes there, Eland, springbuck, wildebeest, and so on. So the grazers, excuse me, the grazers are there very much so, as evidenced in these other sites. And then just to give you, this is a terrible and very old, before modern scanning and certainly before Photoshop, example that Richard Klein put together. He's the bloke who's studied most of these assemblages, certainly the Pleistocene ones. And you can see, looking at this image, you have, I think the red will work on this. Yeah, you've got LSA is later Stone Age, MSA is Middle Stone Age. The later Stone Age at Klipgat starts at 2,000 years ago, when the sand dunes that covered the front of the cave were removed by the modern sea level. And prior to that, we have the Middle Stone Age. So if you look at these lines, there's a species up there, and then you have one line there for the later Stone Age. So jackals were only found in the later Stone Age of this sample. There were none in the Middle Stone Age. And here, for instance, if you look at the Cape fur seals in the later Stone Age, with the coast right at the cave, you've got lots and lots of them, many, many of them. In the Middle Stone Age, the coast was further away, so we find very few seal bones. And that gives you an idea of the changes that take place over with these cyclic sea level changes with lows and highs. Again, grazers, there's the quagga, there's the Cape zebra, blue antelope. During these lower sea levels, blue antelope seem to have been very common in the coastal regions right around our western and southern Cape coast. And so and hartebeest is similarly the case. Buffalo also obligate grazers, and wildebeest, Bontebok even, which very nearly became extinct in the Swellendam area until it was saved. And we get marine elements, the odd dolphin washed up and whales that get washed up. And so you can see that we didn't find any whale remains in the Middle Stone Age, but in the later Stone Age, there were some whale remains and so on. So it's a very, very interesting thing. The other interesting feature is that we have not only got the longhorned buffalo, but we have Cape buffalo. And this occurred, similarly, we had the two species at Classy's River mouth, where they both occur. There must have been very different niches, habitat niches that these two animals were utilizing, one becoming extinct and the other not. Then by about just over 2,000 years ago, we start finding evidence of domesticated animals, and these in the form of first of all, sheep and possible dogs, and then a little bit later on, cattle. And these are typical of what were reported for Khoikhoi people during the historic period. And at the Kelders, at Klipgat, we have some of the earliest, well, if not the earliest pottery that has been found in our country at about 2,000 years ago. We made a reconstruction which includes elements of contact. As you can see here, there's a woman with a clay pipe. She also, not really obvious until I tell you, she also has a copper pendant in her hair. And then we have the domestic animals that occurred. At Pearly Beach, we actually found an example of the foundations of one of these large huts with a fireplace in the middle. And that was a series of large boulders, which presumably were used to anchor the reed and stick frameworks for the huts of people who went down to Pearly Beach, where there not only were marine resources which formed the shell middens there, but also fish traps, which people were able to use. And we believe that, or I believe that the Khoikhoi people, the arrival of Khoikhoi people in much larger groups than there were for San groups, who were also in the region, meant that they had the man and women power to build and maintain these tidal fish traps, which required not only moving quite large boulders into to form the enclosures in which fish were caught, but also to maintain them, because between tides, the boulders, if on with a rough sea, the boulders got shifted and the walls had to be absolutely horizontal, otherwise fish were alerted to the fact that the tide was going out. They came in to feed and then would normally move further out as the tide receded. And in this particular instance, with these traps, the idea was that by the time they were alerted to the receding tide, it was too late and they were trapped. And a wide range of fish could be caught. We had a man at Didam who recorded over a period of a year and a half, recorded his catches in a series of, in one of the fish traps there. So we got a very good idea of what was caught. And of course, fish traps down in the Agulhas region were used right by farmers and the folk right up to the time when legislation was passed preventing stopping the use of tidal fish traps. A bit of a pity in the sense that if they could have been properly managed, it would have been yet another really incredible tourist attraction, illustrating a very important part of our heritage. And indeed, probably if they're as old as 2,000 years or shortly before, indeed, probably the earliest engineering works that occurred in Southern Africa. Then during the later Stone Age at Klipgat, this is the familiar situation. There's the open sea looking out towards Cape Hunklip there in Walker Bay, and the little bay in front of Klipgat, the big opening that looks onto the Plaat and Hermanus over there, with a group of people encamped. You can see somebody bringing in a baby seal they picked up along the beach, pots, animals that were being done, red ochre being ground. There were lots of grindstones in the thing, and sheep. These were, the Kelders was the first, and the Klipgat was the first site at which it was found that domesticated animals had come into Southern Africa by Khoisan, probably Khoisan people, as early as 2,000 years ago. And one of the things about the Kelders is the Klipgat cave. There's an enormous amount of red ochre in the deposits. And one wonders whether the numbers of sheep that we've found, which were very valuable and not readily butchered, the numbers of seals of sheep that were found, plus all the red ochre, the making of large numbers of bone tools and various other aspects of their material culture. One wonders whether this wasn't a place to which people annually or periodically moved in an aggregation to renew tribal friendships and links. And this is something which happens in San society these days. Could well be something like this at the Kelders Cave, which is quite a remarkable place in its own right. And then I have no idea what the time is, but if we look at time and the future, we're already experiencing rising sea levels and storms which are damaging our beaches. And this is the Council for Geoscience has looked at what might happen in the future. And if you look at a mere 5 meter, I think we're predicting far less than 5 meters, if you look at that, the red color shows you that there are large areas around False Bay that would be inundated, and some of that really valuable land and indeed people's holiday places would would be very, very wet. And you can see it continuing around the coast here, and just around the corner from Swartklip is Betty's Bay, very similar to this type of scenario, and the Plaat around beyond Hermanus and the Kelders. Again, that area would be slowly but surely inundated, and storm surges, which would be much higher than the ambient sea level, would cause quite a lot of damage. One of the issues in the changing and the rising of the sea level is the warming of the sea, which is, and the warming of the glaciers, which are melting. So we're not only getting more water into the ocean sea system, but perhaps even more importantly, the sea itself is becoming warmer and expanding. Water expands with temperature, and so you have we only have an increasing volume of ocean, which has to go somewhere, and that's onto the land. Thank you very much.
Graham. Thank you so much, Graham. That was really interesting. I've started my own video. I hope people can see me and hear me. I have, if you have time for us, we have a couple of questions.
Good.
We have from Jonathan Hemp, who wants to know, where did the domesticated sheep and cattle come from?
Okay, that's a good question. Certainly not from South Africa. They were brought into South Africa by herding people, and originally the domestication of sheep took place in the Middle East. So they've over maybe 9, 10, maybe even 1,000 years, sheep were domesticated, strains were developed, and people moved around and acquired sheep. And so they moved from the Middle East into Africa. And then the routes that we so far know, and people are doing DNA studies which are beginning to elucidate some of this, the routes that were thought of, hypothesized, and the evidence is now beginning to support two routes. One that went across the northern part of the Sahara and down into West Africa, and then around the Central African forests and into Botswana, Namibia, South Africa. And then the other hypothesis is down the eastern coast of Africa, and then moving further down and finally reaching South African coasts and moving into our areas. Now, as far as I can see, that Botswana possibility is definitely a strong possibility from the DNA. But we've had different people moving around, and so that acculturation and movement of people would perhaps have been taking place both areas at the same time as people moved around. And dogs, of course, have come in, and the Western dogs seem to be different to the Eastern dogs. I don't want any mail right now.
Okay.
So that's about as good as I can give you at the moment. And 2000.
we have a few more questions if you have time for us, Graham.
Oh, I do.
A question from Robin: did access to seafood diet improve the brain or mental development of the early humans?
Personally, I don't believe it, because because there are other diets like freshwater fish and other plant foods and so on, which also have the relevant omega nutrients. and yes, while they may well improve our brains, I think there's been a bit of an overemphasis of the coastline on that basis. Other people would disagree with that, but I think there's more evidence coming now from interior areas. And one must always bear in mind that if one looks in the Middle Stone Age, which is the time period that anatomically modern people were developing, and this is one of the arguments, that they had better brains because of their the food they were eating, that at that time we also find Middle Stone Age artifacts inland all over the Karoo and around lakes in Botswana and other parts of Africa. So it's quite complex, I think, and it's the coastal thing is a bit, I think, overdone.
Right. Another question from Meredith. First of all, she thanks you for the fascinating presentation. And she wants to know whether you can tell us a bit more about the importance of museum collections for exhibiting this time-consuming detective work that you've done.
Okay. Hi, Meredith. Long time no see. But yes, museum collections are repositories of amazing material and information. We get criticized because we've got all this stuff in storerooms and nobody gets to see it. Well, a large part of it, the tiny little bits of bone and little fragments and things like that, you probably wouldn't want to see. But there are some spectacular issues, and it embarrasses me, for instance, that Ezeco Museum doesn't have a quaternary. That's the last 2.5 odd million years. And that's coming. I mean, it's not there at the moment, but Ezeco develops. It's a money thing. Ezeco has developed enormously. There's some new archaeological exhibits that have come online over the last couple of years. So watch that space, I think. But yes, museums have an enormous responsibility, which is part of what they're there for, not only to show items, but also to use them to educate people and to pass on knowledge that, for instance, the scientists get. And it's in the past, I think some of the scientists have been a bit naughty in that they kind of think of the material in the collections that they curate as their material. Well, it's not. It's the nation's material, and as such, I think more and more we're seeing, certainly in the social and art side, we're seeing more and more small exhibits which are being produced looking at national heritage. And these are temporary and they work very well. But the bigger, more permanent exhibits are very expensive and time consuming. So I think small is good, and it lets you vary things. And that's a way of putting more of that vast amount of material that is sitting in the collections on display, so that people can, in fact, get a better idea, of what museums do and why they're there, and of the material the treasures that exist in the collections.
Graham, a question from Michael. He says, are you concerned? Are you concerned about the rapid rate of climate change and the current extinction rate, or is this just part of the normal cycle that we've seen in the fossil records?
I'm very concerned. I think we've seen that we've almost certainly exacerbated a natural process, and maybe we will stop it altogether if we don't get our butts in line and do something about global change and climate change, because we're rapidly getting to the point, they say, of no return. We still The optimists amongst the scientists say we still have a chance, but we need to stop shilly-shallying and denying the fact that we're on a trip to nowhere if we look at future generations. The likes of me and others who are in our age group are not going to see the devastation that we're causing. We're beginning to see examples of it, but our children and their children will be the ones who bear the brunt of our failure to really address what is a political need. And I think the biggest failure of all is the politicians are so busy fighting each other that they kind of are not ignoring, but not doing anything. It's action that is required, not just pretty talks and meetings.
Graham, if I may put the last question to you. We know that fynbos is a very ancient type of vegetation.
Yeah.
So in the times when the sea receded and we had strandveld, vast areas of strandveld on the coastline, presumably the fynbos remained in the mountainous areas that were not inundated from time to time. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I think fynbos has its own special requirements, and it would have lasted, because if it hadn't, we wouldn't be seeing fynbos these days. So things change. The fynbos itself may well have changed subtly in different areas, but it's been around for well over 15 million years, and unless we do something really drastic, it's here to stay.
Thank you. On that very optimistic note about fynbos at least, thank you, Graham. And on behalf of Whale Coast Conservation and all the people who found your talk so interesting and fascinating, thank you so much for your time. And we hope to hear some more at some future date. Thank you. And thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you very much.